Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the YouSchool podcast. Scott Schimmel here, and I'm excited to have Matt Bishop on the podcast today. Matt and I are, I don't know, I'd call you a friend, so I don't know if you would to me. We're certainly
Yeah, why
friendly,
not?
very
I'm always
least.
looking for a friend.
Friendly. I don't need it anymore, actually. I'm not, but I still call you a friend. Matt and I are connected through good friends. I think that's a part of it. When I have really close friends that also are close friends with you, it's kind of that friendship by association. So I feel like I know you, and I don't. But the reason I wanted you to be on the podcast today is for a few reasons. But this episode is predominantly around student anxiety, and anybody that works with kids, anybody that has kids knows, or anybody who reads the newspaper knows that student anxiety is a big deal these days. And there are so many reasons why. There's so many people that say they know why. Is it cell phones? Is it generational parenting? Is it stress and trauma? There's all these different viewpoints. And so I wanted to have, with all humility, an expert on this podcast to talk about student anxiety from a high level. And then very specifically towards the end of this conversation, I'm going to be asking Matt about how do you deal with it as an adult who works with kids? How do you help a kid who is having an anxious moment or is in an anxious season? How do you really come alongside that student? So listen up as we go into at the end of this episode. So Matt, tell us about you and what the heck you're doing, and just a little context for who you are.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. I'm obviously very excited to be here and get this opportunity to talk to your listeners. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have a private practice in Mission Hills down in San Diego. I work with all types of populations, but one of my favorite populations for sure is to work with teenagers and young adults. I actually love working with teenagers, which is not a very common thing you'll do among licensed mental health professionals. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Of course, when you see teenagers, you don't just see them, but you've talked with a lot of parents and navigating what they want for their kids versus what I see in the office. There's just a lot more legality that goes into it. But in my experience, they're also just a lot more fun. I find that teenagers, they just don't abide by the same social constructs that adults do, or I'd say they just haven't integrated that into their framework of the world.
Okay.
And so,
what do you mean by that? What does that mean?
Well, I mean, just they're still figuring out what proper etiquette is, right? And so they don't mind, or it's not intuitive to them what is appropriate or not appropriate to say, or a way to describe something. Or I had a client look at me the other day, and he used some slang word, and he just goes, "Okay, I get you're old, so I will explain this to you." And it's like, I just love that forthrightness and that honesty, and and the descriptive. I think in today's culture, there's a lot of kind of language monitoring, rightfully so, in a lot of ways, but in a really beautifully honest way, I think teenagers don't necessarily abide by those same rules, which is really refreshing.
And I'm surprised. I was talking to a friend last night. He and I both have middle school boys. And so, when I work with teenagers all the time, but I'm surprised lately how shocked I am when I hear teenage boys particularly use words that I haven't heard in a long time, because as an adult, like you said, like I've stopped using those terms, or my friends don't use those terms, but they're using the same terms and phrases to deride each other as perhaps I did with my friends 25 years ago. And so I'm like, whoa, that's still a phrase. And then the other part of me is like, you can't say that, dude. Like people get sued for that stuff now. But there's this like there's a refreshing part of that. I choose to have that lens as well towards them. This is just refreshing.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. And I think like I'm 32, I'm an adult, but I'm young enough to relate to them on a level in which I feel like can be really helpful to kind of corral them into healthy social etiquette at times. And I do that primarily. I actually, I don't know if this will make my way to any of my clients, but I actually laugh at my clients a lot, and I'm really just in like, oh my God, you did that. And usually that's how I'll start most sessions out when they first come in. If they're in trouble, let's say I was like, okay, dude, what'd you do? How'd you get in my office?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, it was after curfew. I stole my mom's car. I'm like, you did what? Like, what?
What were you thinking?
It kind of shatters that image that they may potentially have of looking at me as a parent or a teacher or a principal or an
Hmm.
authoritative figure, and it allows me to kind of relate to them
Yeah.
on a level, and at the same time
Mm.
say, what were you thinking?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there's a better way for you to behave and live that won't get
Yes.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's think about this. Yeah. Differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you think about student anxiety, that's a big topic. What would you say? What are the things that you find coming out of your mouth as you talk to parents? Like what are some of the causes that you're seeing?
Sure. I mean, I think, there's a conglomeration, right? It's kind of
Hmm.
a perfect storm of so many different variables. And so, of course, like increased screen time is linked to essentially every negative mental health
Right.
outcome you imaginable. It's just more anxiety, more eating
Yep.
disorders, more depression, right? And so what social media is doing to all of our brains, not just our kids' brains,
Hmm.
is pretty radical. Um, you know, just the fact that just how quickly information gets its way to us. And so have a friend who's a elementary school teacher, and it's like, oh my gosh, like they're having conversation in elementary school about like global warming and like
Hmm.
climate change, the world possibly coming to an end, and like
Whoa.
school shooting, and apparently there was an assassination in Iran. And like in third grade, it was like
Yeah.
these things weren't on my radar at all.
No.
And because of social media, because of how fast news travel, because of
Hmm.
kind of the sensationalism of our news networks, and just like kind of putting so many things in your face, I think
Interesting.
kids are a lot more aware of just what's happening on like a big picture
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like that's overwhelming. Like global
Yes.
warming and climate change is like a concern for me, that like causing
Right.
me some anxiety, right? Like what's
Yes.
gonna happen? I don't know.
Yes.
um Especially living in San Diego, it's like, don't take my beautiful weather away. But for a seventh grader, for an eighth grader, for a
Mm,
ninth grader, whatever, to have to kind of make sense of all that and calm
mm.
themselves is a lot more. And then, of course, you have the tremendous pressure on kids to get into universities, to be
Yeah.
competitive academically,
Mm.
athletically, to it's like the list goes on and on and on. Trying to
Right.
find your way, puberty, hormones. I mean, it's just a perfect storm of a lot of stuff. And so, of
Yep.
course, they're gonna respond with an anxiety, right?
Yep.
Like, of course, that's their body's, their nervous system's response.
Hmm.
It's not incongruent for them to have that response. It's actually perfectly congruent with what
Mm.
the environment is feeding them.
Interesting. That's interesting. Where do you see that going with kids? Where do they take their anxiety? What are some of the outlets that you see, both pro and con?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that, like, I'm glad you asked the pro side. I think the pro side is mental health awareness is just it's just so much greater, I think,
Yeah.
nowadays. And
Yep.
um, I actually did a speaking engagement at my old high school last
Mm.
year, which was the most nerve-wracking speaking
Yeah.
engagement I've ever given in
Yeah.
my life.
Yep. I've
I've
done
speaking
that
in front
too.
of large audiences, but going back to my old high school, I was like
Yes. There's
so
something
image.
else.
Um,
It all comes back, doesn't it?
yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, and but I really was just blown away about how I would talk about the consequences of bullying, and I'm not saying it doesn't still happen and stuff, but it just seems like there really has been more of an acceptance that um, people have struggles in life. And I was born and raised in La Jolla, in like one of the most image conscious
Hmm.
communities imaginable. And and the reality that, like, yeah, like depression's a thing, anxiety's a thing. It doesn't make you any less of a person.
Mm.
You should, like, okay to talk about. um I am blown away by my clients who come to my office and seem to already have that understanding. I think that's a
Hmm.
really positive kind of trajectory in our society.
Hmm.
um Now, obviously, it may vary depending on the community, depending on the
Yeah.
culture, whatever, but I think in large part there is a really positive trajectory there. I think on the negative side, or the coping in unhealthy ways, you just see an increase in cutting, an increase in attempted suicide, substance abuse, isolation.
Mm.
I think that, video game addiction,
Hmm.
um, screen time addiction. Just, I think all those things are ways in which it's just an eject button out of anxiety. Just like,
Yeah.
get me out of this. I
Yeah.
need to either zone out and be put into like a trance state,
Hmm.
which is what technology addiction, video game addiction is,
Hmm.
or I need to be able to control my pain, which is what um, which is what like cutting is.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, sadly, the list goes on in that case.
Yeah.
Resources, I think, are there like never before as well, which is nice.
So to get real like granular, uh, when you see a client and they're having a moment, I don't know how you would say that. Different people use different phrases. A breakdown. Um, they can't kind of control themselves. What do you do? How do you? Someone comes in, a student comes in, and they're just emoting a lot. They're feeling big things. Or they're totally shut down. I don't know. What do you do? Is there a framework that you think about? Is there steps that you've used? How do you even be with them?
Yeah. So I think like the craziest thing for a teenager, in my opinion, is when their environment is crazy, but no one is saying, hey, this is actually pretty crazy, right?
Hmm.
And so what we want to do first is always validate their
Hmm.
experience. Like if they have a million different, academic pressures or social pressures,
Hmm.
or their families going through a tough time, maybe their parents aren't getting along, or maybe they broke up with their
Yeah.
boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. um like what's craziest for them is if people either just won't acknowledge how hard that must be for them, or um give them a quick pep talk, grit your teeth and get on with it, right?
Yeah.
And so the metaphor that I like to tell parents is like, if your kid is a runaway horse, what we
Hmm.
want to do is we want to meet them at that place and
Hmm.
then slow them down, right? And the
Yeah.
way that we meet them at that place is we validate. It's like, yeah, this is really tough,
Hmm.
isn't it? Like and you can point out physiological symptoms like yeah, when and let's just say, for example, they're freaking out about SAT prep or college
Hmm.
application.
Hmm.
And you just want to say like, yeah, sometimes like your heart beats really fast and your brain really speeds and you start thinking
Hmm.
worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Oh, that's all totally normal. Like,
Huh.
of course you're going to feel that way, right? Like, and then you're saying like, oh, what if my friends get into their first choice school and I don't get into my first choice school? Like that is totally normal for
Hmm.
your situation. Of course you're going to freak out. I'm actually surprised you're not freaking out more. When I
Yeah.
was your age, I freaked out
Right.
even more than you.
Right.
You're actually really
That's
impressive,
really
right?
validating. Yeah.
Right. And then like once you meet them at that pace, like then it's like then we start slowing them down, right? And you say
Hmm.
like, but you know what? Like we can do this, and like we're gonna take this one day at a time,
Hmm.
and like I'm gonna be with you here every step of the way. And like look at that last essay you did. I read it, it was awesome. Like
Hmm.
you know, and so first we meet them where that and we validate their experience, and then through validation, and then we just start slowing them down through reassurance. Now when
Hmm.
you start to slow them down, they start kind of getting more coherent of their own thoughts, start being
Huh.
able to articulate themselves better. And then that's, in my experience, what you get. That's when kind of we're able to kind of understand kind of the core of what their fear is, right? And
Yeah.
oftentimes, like parents are like, "Kid's so shut down. Why aren't they talking to me?" And it's like that you're making that statement with the assumption that they know how they're feeling and
Right.
they know,
And they're
right? Like
making that choice consciously. Yeah.
right, exactly. Like oftentimes it's like when any of us are in a state of anxiety, it's like communicating in a coherent way is difficult, right?
Yeah.
But when you're a teenager and you've got all these different variables in place, it's like shutting down is like kind of feels like the safest thing to do.
Hmm.
And making sense of everything is really difficult. And
Hmm.
so the way we kind of calm their system down so they can make sense of their own experience is by first validating
Hmm.
and then kind of naming the resources for them. Like, I'm going to be with you every step of your
Hmm.
way.
That's
You
cool.
have your teachers, you have your friends. Like, let's remember, like, we can take this one day at a time.
Yeah.
Like, kind of just hand them resources and remind them and ground them kind of in their reality.
Last week I noticed this thing. All my son's friends follow me on Instagram and vice versa. My son doesn't have that, but they were doing this thing on Instagram stories where they were, I think it was like putting up two two kids' names from their class, from their school. And then there's a whole bunch of questions, basically ranking them. Who has the better hair? Who has the better style? Who's funnier? Who would you rather marry? And so I watched, I don't know, probably 30 or 40 of these things, and different kids were matched up different times. Then all these people would make these comments. And I was sharing that with I was just asking about that with my son the next day. and just saying, to your point, like, that is so absurd that that happens. And that has always happened in middle school, high school. We do that kind of subconsciously maybe, or we talk about people, but to actually literally have that on a screen that you can go and see and go and watch, what do your peers actually think about you? And like from the external ego standpoint, just how
Right.
painful that is. But what I noticed in myself was I was feeling a bunch of stuff too. So as the dad,
Yeah.
as the parent, I all of a sudden I'm doing a couple layers. God, I hope my son doesn't feel overwhelmed by this. I hope he doesn't. I'm feeling anxious for him and how he's going to respond when he sees these things because I can't hide them from him. And then I'm also kind of going through my own. It brings up stuff that I remember when I didn't feel like I was accepted or loved. So there's a whole nother layer that you're talking about. So talk about that because you have maybe the even from a like a attendance lady at a school, attendance person at a school,
Mhm.
and there's students coming up. She's got stuff going on as a student, has having big feelings, and that could be from as simple as like, you're taking my time. I was trying to do some other task, and now you're making me talk to you for the next 2 minutes. I'm irritated, but we all carry in with us. So how do you even kind of address that, the stuff that's going on inside us?
Well, first, I'll say that's a perfect example of what I was referencing at first of it's teenagers not abiding by the same social constructs. Like,
Yes,
if we're honest, we are all in one giant Instagram game of like social
totally. Yeah,
hierarchy
yeah, yeah.
adults, right?
I
It
like
just
that.
isn't as it's just not it's just a little bit more subtle than that,
That's
right? They're
right.
just
Yep.
who's good there, you know, and
Yeah.
so I think so
You're right. That's what we do.
maybe,
Who's richer?
maybe
Who
there's
has
some people who are more involved,
better
but
vacations?
um well, yeah, you know, I think one of my favorite authors, Rob Bell, says 90% of parenting is managing your own anxiety.
Hmm.
And I think it's the same of, you know, whether it's whenever you're interacting with a young person, we're going to have, as therapists, we call it countertransference, which is
Hmm.
basically our reaction to what our client's experiencing.
Hmm.
And so, you know, oh my gosh, if I was in that situation, they would feel this way. Or
Yeah.
if I was with this person, oh, this person reminds me of what I went through when I was a
Hmm.
kid, or this
Yep.
client reminds me of a brother who can be a jerk, whatever. It's our own reaction, right? And so as parents, as teachers, as administrators, as staff members, like, we're going to have our own reactions to kids. Like, it'd be nice if we can have a wonderful, objective, removed,
Yes.
you know,
Neutral. Yep.
neutral base where we can just
Hmm.
observe and not anxiously attach. But of course, all that stuff is coming. And
Hmm.
so, what we want to do is we don't want to just entirely discredit that, because that can really be a bridge to empathy in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
right? If I was in this situation, here's how I would respond, or I was in a situation similar to that, and here's how I did respond, right? But what we need to do is we need to come back to who the main character is, and the main character in that case would be your son, right?
Hmm. Yep.
It's not you, right? So if it
Yes.
was
Yep.
you, then it's like we're panicking and we're
Yep.
making, you know, responding out of our own pain or our own trauma, and it's like, well, how is my son experiencing this? Like,
Yeah.
you know, there are
Versus,
things.
I'm gonna take him shopping tomorrow, get him fresher duds, and let's go get him a haircut, and let's make sure he doesn't have that
He has to
experience
win
because
this
yeah,
competition.
that's right. Yeah.
That's
Oh, now I
the
know what
goal.
this game is.
Right. Yeah. It's not empathy and don't participate and everyone belongs. It's you must win, right? That's the goal. Yeah. I think just kind of being aware of your own stuff, and you know,
Hmm.
it's so classic, and it's so cliche and so classic. I'm almost surprised when it happens to my clients, and yet I'm almost not surprised because it happens so often, of parents pushing their own agenda on their
Hmm.
kids, whether it's
Yeah.
athletically, whether it's academically, whether it's socially, right? Like, it's like I had to be the best, so you have to be the best, and there's this kind
Yep.
of vicarious enmeshment that happens, right?
Hmm. Yep.
And so I think it's like managing your own anxiety is owning your own stuff.
Hmm.
It's recognizing, okay, this is really anxious for me. I'm curious whether this is anxiety inducing for my son.
Hmm.
I'm not going to necessarily assume that. I'm just going to be curious about that, right?
Yep.
And and you know, there are some cases where you can ask your son, like, you know, does this bother you? And they may say no, and maybe it does, or, you know, I'm not saying you're always going to get an accurate kind of portrayal of their internal experience
Yep.
from
Yep.
from the teenager. Um, but I think owning your own stuff, realizing when you're having a big reaction, I can guarantee, like, you know, when you're at that 8 out of 10, you know, activation scale, like, almost nothing ever productive happens when we're at
Right.
that
Right.
place, right?
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's like
And to
there
that
is
point, kids are very irritating when they're activated, when they're at 8 to 10, whether it is they're throwing a tantrum, whatever that looks like for them, throwing a fit, saying, I know having teenagers myself, um, they'll just get mean. They'll get mean. Or I think of our youngest, she's 6, she's just literally tantrums or sulking. And even then causes some anxiety in me, or as a lot of other parents or adults do. Like, why are you? What's wrong with you? Why don't you? And then it's so tempting to start poking. I love what you said, that sense of being curious. There's some
right.
neutrality to that. Just kind of flipping that switch to say, okay, let me be curious right now. I wonder why he might be acting this way. I wonder what's going on with me. I don't know. You can almost objectively look a little bit and pause maybe a few more seconds before you react in a really unhelpful, unproductive way.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say not just a few seconds. I mean, like, I mean, obviously there's the immediacy. We want to address what needs to be addressed in the
Yeah.
immediate term. But even coming back around to a conversation when we're at a lower activation level, right? When
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of mellow, like, hey, I wanted to follow up on that conversation that we had, right? Like,
Mm.
no one's going anywhere, and I think a lot of times there can be an immediacy, a sense that this conversation needs to happen now.
Yeah.
And I think, that's one of the benefits I have as a therapist of, like, when parents, like, I've been trying to get this through to them for months, and and
Right.
now all of a sudden they kind of have this epiphany. It's like, well, I also have the benefit of, like, they're coming to my office kind of mellow, and then we get to revisit these things. You're trying to address these things in the moment when both
Yes.
of your
Yeah.
intensities are really high. They're
Mm-hmm.
defensive.
Mm-hmm.
You're frustrated, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like, boy, that's gonna go well, right? Like,
Right.
it's just
Yeah. Well,
so I do kind of have an unfair advantage in that.
yes. Well, thank God for people like you, which is whether as you're listening, whether as a parent you have the means or the resources to send your kid to therapists, to therapy. So I know there's a kind of an emerging industry in life coaching for teens. Some people call what we do in some version of that, or close mentors, adults. So having other adults involved in your kids' lives, it's actually something you can do. You can insert as long as they're still in the house. You can organize, you can arrange adults to be around. You can let the adults
Yeah,
know in your life, I want you to be involved in my kid. I want you to ask them questions. You can invite them to do that.
yeah,
But to specifically have support from someone who's licensed, trained, has a framework, knows how to diagnose, knows how to walk alongside kids like you. Just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, Matt, maybe you can speak to a couple things. One, if I'm a parent or someone working in a school, what are the reasons I ought to consider getting my kid or that kid connected to a therapist? And then secondly, how would they specifically connect with you?
yeah. I think if you notice any coping mechanisms that are destructive in a way that you feel like there can be some serious harm that it's being done to my kid. So if you notice they're cutting a lot,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's a mental health issue, right? If they're
Yep.
smoking weed, daily, or just you give them consequence after consequence after
Mm-hmm.
consequence, and they're still smoking or they're still drinking. It's like, that
Mm-hmm.
that to me is a mental health issue. If they're acting out violently, um, uh, in excess, of course, like for young boys, they're kind of figuring out their bodies, and there can be some, but
Mm-hmm.
it really in excess, then I think that could be a mental health issue. And if you're just if you notice that they're depressed in a way that they're just sleeping all the time, or they're avoiding socializing, or or if there's a difficult life transition. I mean, a divorce, a really difficult breakup on their end. I can't tell you how often parents kind of dismiss
Mm-hmm.
breakups as puppy love. And what I try to say is, yeah, it is puppy love, but your kid's a puppy, and puppy love is
Mm.
for the puppies. And so it can be really, really difficult for them. And it's like, when you had your breakup at 25, it's a lot different than a breakup at 15, when the
Yeah.
entire school knows and who's going to
Yeah.
sit next to it at lunch, and all that stuff.
Right.
It can
Yeah.
be really difficult. And
Mm.
so I think those are just some big reasons. And I'll just say I love what you said about having kind of some other adults around them to be good influences, because
Mm-hmm.
in kind of natural teenage development, adolescent development, it is hey, mom and dad, this is where you stop and I begin, and I'm going to differentiate from you and be
Yeah.
my own person. And that's
Yep.
healthy,
Yep.
normal, great development. That's perfectly
Disruptive.
fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very disruptive, and it's frustrating when they just go into the room or you ask them how school is and they say fine, they don't want to talk. That's like,
Yeah.
it can be frustrating. And so that is the time where it is good to have those kind of, whether it's a life coach or a mentor or uncle and aunt, a therapist, whatever, kind of come alongside and walk alongside your kids. So
How can they get connected with you and what you're up to?
yeah, so I'm actually going through a big transition in my own life. I was at a wonderful private practice called Soul Care House for the last 3.5 years. I'm transitioning out of that. And so you can email me at matt@mattbishoptherapy.com. The website will be mattbishoptherapy.com eventually. Not quite up right now,
a couple
although
weeks.
maybe by the time this is uploaded, it will be up.
Yeah.
So you can always look me up there at some point.
We'll have that in the show notes. And also for those of you listening who work in schools, professional development is a big deal. And Matt's a part of the YouSchool team broadly to come in and bring great tools and experiences to educate and equip adults how to do this kind of work well. Like the whole thing we're trying to do with YouSchool is create environments, cultures inside schools where the natural result is kids can construct meaningful lives for themselves. And as much as anxiety is creeping in, it has crept in to the normal school day, we need adults, we need more and more tools, more equipment, more framework, more chances to learn about how do we care for kids well. Because all this is for the sake of kids, that they might be able to design and construct great lives for themselves. That's why we're in this game. So thank you, Matt. Thanks for being a part of the Broad YouSchool team. Congrats on the transition. And we're going to be sending people, there's so many broken people, myself included, we're going to be sending people to you for years to come. And thanks for all the work that you do to care for kids and support families.
Hey, back at you, man. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for joining in on the YouSchool podcast. We'd love to share with you the resources available on our website at theyouschool.com. Not just articles, ebooks, worksheets, and other podcast episodes, but specifically, you should know about a free course we have available called the Real Me course. It's digital, it's interactive, and it'll guide you to get clear about who you are and the great story you could tell with your life. So go register for a free account and get started on the Real Me course today at theyouschool.com. That's theyouschool.com.